My name is Natalie Harrison, and I'm 29 years old. Today, I'm standing in front of the house where I grew up in Austin, Texas, holding a check for $1 million. 11 years ago, my mother threw me out of this very house with words that still echo in my mind: "You are the biggest mistake of my life. Never come back." Today, I'm not here to beg for forgiveness. I'm here to prove something nobody expected. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you've ever felt unwanted by your own family, hit that like button because this story is for you. And make sure to subscribe because what my family did to me and how I turned the tables will shock you. Trust me, you won't see this ending coming. Standing here now, memories flood back like a tsunami of pain I thought I'd buried forever. This pristine suburban house with its perfectly manicured lawn and white picket fence had been my prison for 18 years. Behind those cheerful yellow walls lived a family that made my life a living hell, led by a woman who should have protected me but instead became my greatest tormentor. Dorothy Harrison, my mother, had spent nearly 2 decades convincing me I was worthless, unwanted, and a burden she never asked for. She succeeded in making me believe I was nothing more than an accident that ruined her perfect life with her golden child, my sister Jennifer. The irony wasn't lost on me as I adjusted my designer suit and felt the weight of success in my briefcase. The little girl who once cowered in that house had built an empire, but the scars from this place still ran deeper than any achievement could heal. I could see neighbors peeking through their curtains, probably wondering who this confident woman was and why she looked so familiar. Some of them had witnessed my humiliation 11 years ago when I was dragged out like garbage on my 18th birthday. None of them had lifted a finger to help. My hands trembled slightly as I thought about walking through that front door again. Part of me wanted to turn around and drive back to my penthouse in Silicon Valley, back to my successful company and the life I'd built from absolutely nothing. But I'd come too far to back down now. The frightened, broken girl who left this house was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd learned to fight, to survive, and ultimately to thrive. The question was whether Dorothy Harrison was ready to face the monster she'd created. Growing up in the Harrison household meant living in a world where love was rationed and cruelty was abundant. From my earliest memories, Dorothy made it crystal clear that I was the unwanted child, the mistake that came along and ruined her plans for the perfect family. Jennifer, 3 years older, was everything I could never be in my mother's eyes. She was planned, wanted, and cherished. I was the accident that followed, the burden that stretched the family budget and stole attention from the precious firstborn. The favoritism wasn't subtle. While Jennifer got piano lessons, ballet classes, and a room filled with expensive toys, I got hand-me-down clothes and was expected to earn my keep through endless chores. By the age of 8, I was responsible for cleaning the entire house, doing laundry, and preparing simple meals while Jennifer played with friends or practiced her various talents. When I dared to ask why I couldn't take dance classes too, Dorothy's response was always the same: "We can't afford to waste money on someone who'll probably quit anyway. Jennifer actually has talent." The physical abuse started early, but it was the psychological warfare that did the most damage. Dorothy had a gift for finding my weakest spots and pressing until I broke. When I was 12 years old, I accidentally knocked over an antique vase while dusting. It had belonged to my grandmother, and Dorothy treasured it more than she'd ever treasured me. Her rage was volcanic. She didn't just punish me, she destroyed me with words that cut deeper than any physical blow. "You ruin everything you touch," she screamed, her face twisted with genuine hatred. "I should have given you away when I had the chance. At least then someone else would have to deal with your clumsiness." The punishment for breaking that vase was spending the night locked in the basement, hungry and terrified, while Dorothy made sure I understood the full weight of my worthlessness. She'd come down periodically to remind me of how disappointed she was, how I'd proven once again that I couldn't be trusted with anything valuable. "This is what happens when you don't think," she'd say, leaving me alone in the darkness with my guilt and fear. My father, Richard, was physically present but emotionally absent. He'd witness these scenes of abuse and do nothing more than retreat to his study with a beer and the television. When I'd approach him later, hoping for some comfort or protection, he'd simply say, "Your mother knows best, Natalie. You need to try harder to make her happy." His weakness enabled Dorothy's cruelty and taught me early that I couldn't count on anyone to save me. Jennifer perfected the art of manipulation, often setting me up for failure and then watching with satisfaction as Dorothy unleashed her fury on me. She'd deliberately break something and blame me, or tell lies about things I'd supposedly said or done. The worst part was how she'd comfort me afterward, playing the caring big sister while secretly relishing my pain. "I'm sorry Mom got so angry," she'd whisper while I cried. "Maybe if you weren't so clumsy, she wouldn't have to punish you." School became my only refuge, the one place where I could excel and feel valuable. I threw myself into academics with desperate intensity, earning straight A's and recognition from teachers who saw potential in me. But even my academic success became a source of tension at home. Dorothy would dismiss my achievements as luck or favoritism from teachers, while praising Jennifer's mediocre grades as evidence of her natural intelligence and charm. Social isolation was another tool in Dorothy's arsenal. I wasn't allowed to have friends over because our house needed to maintain its perfect image, and Dorothy didn't want other children seeing how differently I was treated. When classmates invited me to birthday parties or sleepovers, the answer was always no. "We can't trust you to behave properly in other people's homes," Dorothy would explain. "Besides, you have chores to do." Meanwhile, Jennifer's social calendar was packed with activities and friendships that Dorothy actively encouraged and supported. The psychological abuse escalated as I grew older and showed signs of independence. Dorothy would remind me daily that I was an unwanted burden, that her life would have been so much better without me, that I'd stolen opportunities from Jennifer simply by existing. "I could have gone back to school if I didn't have to deal with you," she'd say during her frequent tirades. "Jennifer deserves a mother who can focus on her completely, not one who's constantly cleaning up your messes." By the time I reached high school, I'd learned to make myself as small and invisible as possible. I did my chores without complaint, stayed out of Dorothy's way, and focused all my energy on preparing for escape through education. I applied for every scholarship I could find, knowing that college would be my only path to freedom. What I didn't realize was that Dorothy had no intention of letting me go easily, and that my academic success would become the catalyst for the final, devastating betrayal that would change my life forever. My junior year of high school marked the beginning of the end. While other kids my age were worried about prom dates and college applications, I was working 2 part-time jobs and maintaining a 4.0 GPA, determined to earn my way out of the Harrison household through academic excellence. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Thompson, had been helping me apply for scholarships, and when the acceptance letter from MIT arrived with a full ride, I thought my prayers had been answered. I was wrong. Dorothy's reaction to my MIT acceptance wasn't pride or excitement. It was pure rage masquerading as disappointment. "You think you're so smart," she said, barely glancing at the scholarship letter. "You think you're better than this family." Her tone was ice cold, and I recognized the dangerous calm that preceded her worst explosions. "College will just fill your head with more nonsense about how special you are. You'll come crawling back when reality hits." Jennifer, now 21 and still living at home with no real direction in life, saw my acceptance as a personal insult. She'd applied to several schools but been rejected from all her top choices, settling for community college classes she rarely attended. My success highlighted her failures, and Dorothy's obvious favoritism couldn't protect Jennifer from the sting of being overshadowed by the family disappointment. The psychological warfare intensified immediately. Dorothy began monitoring my every move, looking for any excuse to punish me and prove that I was too irresponsible for college. She went through my room daily, searching for evidence of wrongdoing, reading my diary and criticizing every private thought I'd written. When she found nothing damaging, she began creating problems where none existed. The first major setup came when Dorothy accused me of stealing money from her purse. I'd never taken anything from her, but she insisted $50 was missing and I was the only possible culprit. "I've always known you were a thief," she declared, searching my room and finding nothing. "You're probably hiding it somewhere, planning to use it for drugs or other garbage. When the money mysteriously reappeared in her car a week later, there was no apology, just more suspicion about what else I might have done. Jennifer escalated the campaign by spreading rumors about me at school. She told people I was jealous of her, that I'd threatened her, that I was unstable and possibly dangerous. Some of these stories made their way back to Dorothy, who used them as ammunition for her belief that I was fundamentally flawed. "Even your own sister is afraid of you," Dorothy would say during her increasingly frequent verbal attacks. "What does that tell you about yourself?" The harassment campaign reached a new low when Dorothy began interfering with my job. She'd call my employers with fake emergencies, forcing me to leave work early and creating the impression that I was unreliable. When I confronted her about it, she claimed she was just being a concerned mother. "You're working too much and your grades will suffer," she said with false sweetness. "I'm just looking out for your best interests." But the most devastating blow came when Dorothy discovered I'd been quietly dating Tom, a boy from my chemistry class. We'd kept the relationship secret because I knew Dorothy would find a way to ruin it, but Jennifer spotted us together at the library and immediately ran home to report. Dorothy's reaction was swift and brutal. She accused me of being sexually promiscuous, of lying and sneaking around, of bringing shame on the family name. "I always knew you'd turn out to be a slut," she screamed, her face twisted with disgust. "Just like your real mother probably was." The comment about my real mother stopped me cold. Dorothy had never mentioned anything about my parentage before, always insisting I was her biological child despite how differently she treated me compared to Jennifer. When I asked what she meant, she just smiled cruelly and said, "Ask me again when you're older. If you ever grow up to deserve the truth." That night, Dorothy forced me to call Tom and break up with him while she listened on the extension. She dictated the words I had to say, making me tell him I'd been lying about everything, that I didn't really care about him, that he should stay away from me. The humiliation was complete, and Tom's hurt and confused response broke something inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be fixed. Jennifer watched all of this with barely concealed glee, occasionally offering fake comfort that felt more like salt in my wounds. "Mom's just worried about you," she'd say with mock concern. "Maybe if you hadn't been so sneaky, she wouldn't have to be so strict." But I could see the satisfaction in her eyes, the pleasure she took in watching me suffer for achieving something she couldn't. As my 18th birthday approached, the atmosphere in the house became increasingly toxic. Dorothy made it clear that adult children who couldn't follow rules weren't welcome in her home. She began talking about how peaceful the house would be with just her and Jennifer, how much money they'd save, how much easier everything would be. I started making quiet preparations for independence, assuming I'd need to move out eventually but hoping to maintain some connection to my family. I had no idea that Dorothy and Jennifer were planning something far more cruel and permanent, a final humiliation that would sever all ties and leave me completely alone in the world. My 18th birthday was 3 weeks away, and they were counting down the days until they could destroy me completely. My 18th birthday dawned gray and cold, matching the atmosphere inside the Harrison house. There was no birthday cake, no presents, no acknowledgement that this was supposed to be a special day. Instead, I woke up to find my belongings packed in garbage bags, stacked neatly by the front door like trash waiting for pickup. Dorothy stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed, wearing an expression of grim satisfaction that I'd seen before but never directed at me with such finality. "Happy birthday," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Today you become an adult, which means you're no longer my responsibility." She gestured toward the bags with mock cheerfulness. "I've saved you the trouble of packing." "You're welcome." My father sat at the kitchen table, hidden behind his newspaper like a coward, refusing to make eye contact. Jennifer lounged on the couch in her pajamas, pretending to watch television while obviously enjoying every moment of my humiliation. This was clearly a planned performance, choreographed for maximum emotional damage. "I don't understand," I stammered, though part of me had been expecting something like this. "I got into MIT. I have a full scholarship. I was going to leave for college anyway in a few months." Dorothy's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You think you're going to college?" You think you deserve that scholarship? She picked up my MIT acceptance letter from the counter, the one I'd treasured for months as proof of my worth. You're the biggest mistake of my life, Natalie. I've wasted 18 years trying to make something decent out of you, and I'm done. She tore the letter in half, then in quarters, letting the pieces fall to the floor like confetti of my destroyed dreams. I called MIT yesterday and told them about your real character, about how you steal and lie and manipulate people. I told them about your psychological problems, your instability, your complete lack of moral fiber. The world tilted around me as I realized what she'd done. You didn't, I whispered, but I could see from her triumphant expression that she absolutely had. That scholarship was earned. You had no right. I had every right, Dorothy snarled, dropping all pretense of maternal concern. I'm your mother, and I know what's best for you. College would just give you more opportunities to hurt people, to cause more damage. The world will be safer with you working minimum wage jobs where you can't pretend to be something you're not. Jennifer finally spoke up from her position on the couch, her voice sickeningly sweet. Maybe this is for the best, Natalie. You never seemed happy here anyway. Maybe you'll find peace somewhere else. I turned to my father, desperately hoping for some sign of support, some indication that he would stop this madness. Dad, please. You know this isn't right. You know I've never done anything wrong. Richard slowly folded his newspaper and looked at me with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of our supposed relationship. Your mother has made her decision, he said quietly. I support her completely. You've brought nothing but stress and conflict to this household. Dorothy moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than any scream. Let me be very clear about something, Natalie. You are not welcome here anymore. You will not contact us, you will not come back, you will not tell anyone that you're related to us. As far as this family is concerned, you died today. She opened the front door and stood beside it expectantly. Get out. Take your garbage and get out of my house. I gathered the bags with shaking hands, my mind struggling to process the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about my life. As I struggled with the heavy bags, neighbors began to appear on their porches and in their windows, drawn by the commotion. Dorothy raised her voice, ensuring they could all hear her final declaration. This girl has been nothing but trouble, she announced to the growing audience. We've tried everything to help her, but she's chosen drugs and theft and promiscuity over family values. We cannot enable her destructive behavior anymore. I stood on the front porch with my meager possessions, facing a neighborhood full of people who'd known me since childhood, watching them absorb Dorothy's lies without question. Mrs. Patterson from next door shook her head sadly. Mr. Johnson from across the street muttered something about kids these days. None of them questioned Dorothy's version of events or offered to help me. The final blow came when Aunt Patricia's car pulled into the driveway. I'd been counting on her as my one potential ally, the only family member who'd ever shown me genuine kindness. She got out slowly, looking uncomfortable but determined. Aunt Patricia, I called out desperately. Please, you know I'm not what she's saying I am. You know I'm a good person. Patricia approached me with what looked like genuine sadness, but when she spoke, her words destroyed my last hope. I'm sorry, honey, she said softly. But your mother knows you better than anyone. If she says this is necessary, then maybe it really is for the best. Dorothy's smile was pure vindication. Even my aunt, the one person I'd thought might stand up for me, had chosen Dorothy's version of reality over the truth she'd witnessed with her own eyes. I was truly alone. Standing on that sidewalk with everything I owned in garbage bags, I felt something break inside me that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. But alongside the devastation, something else began to grow. A cold, hard determination that would eventually become my salvation. As I walked away from the only home I'd ever known, I made myself a promise. Someday, I would come back to this house, and when I did, it would be on my own terms. I'll show you what a mistake can accomplish, I whispered to myself as I struggled down the street with my bags. I'll show all of you. The first night on my own, I learned what real desperation felt like. With nowhere else to go and only $47 to my name, I found myself in Riverside Park as darkness fell, trying to make a bed out of my clothes in one of the covered picnic areas. The temperature dropped into the 40s, and I spent the night shivering and jumping at every sound, terrified of what might happen to an 18-year-old girl alone in the dark. Around 3 in the morning, 3 teenagers found my makeshift camp and decided I was an easy target. They grabbed one of my bags before I could stop them, running off with half my possessions while laughing at my helpless shouts. Inside that bag were my few nice clothes, my high school yearbook, and the small amount of jewelry I'd inherited from my grandmother. But more devastating than the theft itself was the realization that this was my new reality. I wasn't a student with a bright future anymore. I was homeless, friendless, and completely vulnerable. The next morning brought new challenges. Every business I approached for work took one look at my disheveled appearance and homeless status and told me they weren't hiring. Without an address, I couldn't fill out applications properly. Without a reference who wasn't Dorothy or Richard, I couldn't prove I was reliable. The few places that seemed interested changed their minds when they called my previous employers and discovered Dorothy had been sabotaging my reputation for months. On my third day of living rough, exhaustion and hunger had reduced me to searching through dumpsters behind restaurants, hoping to find something edible that hadn't spoiled. I was elbow-deep in garbage behind a Mexican place when I heard a familiar voice. "Natalie? Natalie Harrison, is that you?" I turned around to find Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, my sophomore English teacher, staring at me in shock. She was a small woman with kind eyes who'd always encouraged my writing, but I'd never felt more humiliated in my life than I did at that moment, caught literally digging through trash. "Mrs. Rodriguez," I stammered, trying to wipe grease off my hands. I dropped something and... She took in my dirty clothes, my hollow cheeks, the desperate look in my eyes, and her expression shifted to one of deep concern. "Honey, what's happened to you? Weren't you supposed to start at MIT this fall?" The whole story came pouring out of me then, 3 days of terror and hopelessness and betrayal spilling over in the parking lot of a strip mall. Mrs. Rodriguez listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her anger growing as I described Dorothy's systematic destruction of my future. "This is not acceptable," she said firmly when I finished. "You're coming home with me right now. Maria and I have a guest room, and you're going to stay there until we figure out how to fix this mess." Mrs. Rodriguez and her wife Maria treated me with more kindness in one evening than my own family had shown me in 18 years. They fed me a real meal, let me take a proper shower, and gave me clean clothes that actually fit. For the first time since my birthday, I allowed myself to hope that things might work out. But Dorothy's reach was longer than I'd anticipated. Mrs. Rodriguez spent 2 days making phone calls, trying to repair the damage Dorothy had done to my MIT prospects, when Jennifer and 2 of her friends showed up at the restaurant where I'd finally gotten a job as a waitress. They didn't cause a scene immediately. Instead, they ordered food and waited for the dinner rush when the restaurant was packed with customers. Then Jennifer stood up and began screaming at me across the crowded dining room. "How dare you tell people we threw you out?" she shouted, her voice carrying to every table. "We've been worried sick about you, and here you are telling lies to get sympathy." Her friends joined in, creating such a disturbance that other customers began leaving, worried about their safety. Jennifer accused me of stealing from the family, of lying about Dorothy's treatment, of being unstable and potentially dangerous. "She's been in and out of psychiatric treatment," she announced to the terrified diners. "We tried to help her, but she's chosen to live on the streets instead of following basic rules." My manager, a nervous man named Steve who'd only hired me reluctantly, watched the chaos with growing alarm. When Jennifer and her friends finally left, he pulled me aside and told me not to bother coming back. "I can't have this kind of drama in my restaurant," he said apologetically. "I'm sorry, but I have other employees and customers to think about." The attack on my employment was just the beginning. 2 days later, Aunt Patricia called Mrs. Rodriguez with a story that painted me as a troubled teenager with a history of manipulation and attention-seeking behavior. She claimed I'd always been jealous of Jennifer, that I'd made threats against the family, that Dorothy had endured years of abuse from me before finally being forced to take protective action. "I'm just concerned about you and Maria," Patricia said, her voice full of fake worry. Natalie can be very convincing when she wants something, but she's not the innocent victim she pretends to be. The family has documentation of her psychological problems if you need proof. I watched Mrs. Rodriguez's face change as she listened to Patricia's lies. The doubt crept in slowly, the way it always did when people heard a compelling story that contradicted what they'd observed with their own eyes. By the time she hung up the phone, the warmth in her expression had cooled considerably. "Natalie," she said carefully, "I need you to be completely honest with me. Your aunt is saying some very serious things about your behavior at home. She's suggesting that maybe there are two sides to this story." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Patricia had been at family gatherings where she'd seen Dorothy's cruelty firsthand. She'd witnessed the favoritism, the verbal abuse, the systematic destruction of my self-esteem. But when forced to choose sides, she'd chosen the easier path of supporting Dorothy's narrative rather than defending the truth. Within a week, Mrs. Rodriguez's attitude had shifted completely. She suggested I might need professional help to deal with my family issues. She recommended I consider apologizing to Dorothy and asking for another chance. When I refused, she made it clear that I was no longer welcome in her home. Once again, I found myself on the street with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. But this time, something was different. The naive girl who'd believed in the inherent goodness of people was gone, replaced by someone harder and more realistic. I'd learned that even kind people could be turned against you if the lies were convincing enough. It was during my second round of homelessness that I met Jake Matthews at the public library. He was a computer science student at UT, working on a project about entrepreneurship, and he made the mistake of leaving his laptop unattended while he went to the bathroom. When he came back, he found me staring at his screen with obvious fascination. "Sorry," I said quickly, embarrassed to be caught. "I wasn't trying to snoop. I just haven't seen a computer in weeks, and your code is really elegant." Instead of being angry, Jake was intrigued. We started talking about programming and business theory, and I found myself sharing ideas I'd been developing about technology solutions to social problems. He was impressed by my insights and suggested we grab coffee to continue the conversation. That coffee turned into hours of discussion about innovation and startups and the power of technology to change lives. For the first time in months, I felt intellectually stimulated and valued for my mind rather than dismissed because of my circumstances. When Jake learned about my situation, he didn't lecture me about family reconciliation or suggest I deserved what had happened. Instead, he offered something much more valuable, a partnership. "I've been looking for someone with your analytical skills," he said simply. "I have access to resources and connections. You have ideas and determination. Maybe we can build something together." It wasn't charity or pity. It was recognition of my potential and an offer to help me transform that potential into something real. For the first time since my 18th birthday, I began to believe that I might have a future after all. Working with Jake gave me purpose and hope, but Dorothy and Jennifer weren't finished trying to destroy my life. I'd been collaborating with him on a software project for 3 months, slowly building both a product and my confidence, when the first major sabotage attempt nearly ended everything before it began. I'd been accepted to UT as a transfer student, using my high school transcripts and ACE test scores to bypass the MIT disaster. Jake had helped me navigate the financial aid process, and I'd managed to secure enough grants and loans to cover tuition. I was finally going to get my education, just through a different path than I'd originally planned. That's when Dorothy decided to escalate her campaign of destruction. She called the UT admissions office with a story that painted me as psychologically unstable and potentially dangerous to other students. She claimed I'd been institutionalized multiple times for violent behavior, that I'd made threats against family members, and that she was calling out of concern for campus safety. "I understand you want to give troubled young people a chance," she told the admissions counselor, her voice full of fake maternal worry. "But sometimes compassion can put innocent people at risk. I would hate for other students to be hurt because you didn't have all the information about Natalie's history." The effect was immediate and devastating. UT placed a hold on my enrollment pending a psychological evaluation and background check. I was required to provide documentation proving my mental stability and undergo a comprehensive psychiatric assessment at my own expense. For someone living paycheck to paycheck, the cost was prohibitive, and the stigma was overwhelming. Jake stood by me through the entire ordeal, helping me find resources for affordable mental health services and supporting me through the humiliating process of proving my sanity to strangers. The psychiatrist who evaluated me was thorough but kind, ultimately concluding that I showed no signs of mental illness beyond the normal stress responses someone would exhibit after experiencing family trauma and homelessness. In my professional opinion, Dr. Sarah Chin wrote in her report, "Ms. Harrison presents as a remarkably resilient individual who has overcome significant adversity without developing maladaptive coping mechanisms. Her goals are realistic, her thinking is clear, and her emotional responses are entirely appropriate to her circumstances." But Dorothy wasn't finished. When the psychiatric evaluation failed to support her claims, she tried a different approach. Jennifer created multiple fake social media profiles and began posting detailed accusations about my character, claiming I was a con artist who manipulated people for money and sympathy. She created fake screenshots of conversations where I supposedly admitted to lying about my family situation and laughing about how easy it was to fool bleeding heart liberals. The social media campaign was sophisticated and coordinated. Jennifer and her friends shared the posts across multiple platforms, tagged mutual acquaintances from high school, and even contacted professors at UT to warn them about my character. Within days, the narrative had spread throughout our small community, painting me as an elaborate fraud who deceived everyone about my circumstances. The damage to my reputation was severe and immediate. Fellow students who'd been friendly began avoiding me. Professors looked at me with suspicion during class. Even some of Jake's friends suggested he should distance himself from me to protect his own credibility. The isolation was almost as painful as the original rejection from my family. Jake, however, surprised everyone by doubling down on his support for me. He used his own social media presence and connections to investigate the source of the false posts, quickly discovering that they all traced back to accounts created within days of each other and linked to Jennifer's digital footprint. He documented the harassment campaign methodically, creating a comprehensive report that exposed the coordinated nature of the attacks. "This isn't random criticism," he explained to anyone who would listen. "This is a systematic campaign of defamation by people who have a personal vendetta against Natalie. The evidence is overwhelming." But even with proof of the fabricated attacks, the damage was hard to undo. People who'd already formed negative opinions based on Jennifer's lies weren't interested in contrary evidence. The false narrative had taken on a life of its own, spreading beyond our immediate community to potential employers and professional contacts. The crisis deepened when Dorothy contacted Jake's parents directly, spinning a tale about their son being manipulated by a dangerous young woman with a history of mental instability and criminal behavior. She painted herself as a concerned mother trying to protect another family from the same devastation I'd supposedly caused her own. "I hate to be the one to tell you this," she told Jake's mother during a carefully orchestrated phone call, "but your son is being used by someone who preys on good-hearted people. Natalie has done this before, and it never ends well for the families who try to help her." Jake's parents, who'd been supportive of our partnership and friendship, suddenly began pressuring him to end our professional relationship. They worried about their son's reputation and future prospects, concerned that association with someone so controversial could damage his career before it even started. The pressure from his family created the first real strain in our partnership. Jake was torn between loyalty to me and respect for his parents' concerns. For several weeks, it seemed like Dorothy might succeed in isolating me completely once again, destroying the one genuine relationship I'd managed to build since leaving home. It was during this period of uncertainty that I made a crucial decision. Instead of waiting passively for others to defend me or hoping the truth would eventually prevail, I decided to take control of my own narrative. I began documenting everything systematically, creating a detailed timeline of Dorothy's harassment with supporting evidence for each incident. I also started recording phone calls and saving text messages, building a comprehensive case that demonstrated the coordinated nature of the attacks against me. When Dorothy called UT again with new fabricated concerns, I was ready with evidence showing a pattern of harassment that undermined her credibility. The turning point came when Professor Williams, who taught my advanced programming course, took a personal interest in the situation. He'd been impressed by my work and disturbed by the obvious campaign against me. Using his connections in the tech industry, he helped me trace the digital fingerprints of the harassment campaign back to its sources, creating undeniable proof of Jennifer's involvement. "What's being done to this student is unconscionable," Professor Williams wrote in a letter to the university administration. "The evidence clearly shows a coordinated effort to destroy her educational opportunities through fabricated allegations and cyber harassment. The university has a responsibility to protect students from this kind of targeted abuse." Armed with comprehensive evidence and growing support from faculty members, I finally had the ammunition to fight back effectively. UT not only removed all holds on my enrollment but issued a formal warning to Dorothy about continuing to contact the university with false information. They also implemented security measures to prevent further harassment of students by outside parties. The victory was meaningful but incomplete. I'd managed to preserve my education and expose some of Dorothy's tactics, but the damage to my reputation in the broader community remained. More importantly, I'd learned that I couldn't rely on others to defend me or expect institutions to automatically side with truth over manipulation. Dorothy had shown me that she was willing to use any weapon available to destroy my chances at success. She wasn't going to give up just because one avenue of attack had been closed off. If I wanted to truly escape her reach and build the life I deserved, I was going to have to become as strategic and relentless as she was. The frightened, defensive girl who'd been reacting to attacks was evolving into someone who could anticipate them and strike back. I was learning to play Dorothy's game, and I was getting better at it with every battle. By my junior year at UT, Jake and I had developed our software project into something with real commercial potential. Our application helped nonprofit organizations manage volunteers and resources more efficiently, and we were getting interest from major foundations and social service agencies. Success felt tantalizingly close, but Dorothy seemed to sense my growing confidence and decided to escalate her attacks to a whole new level. The first sign of the new campaign came when a private investigator showed up at my apartment, claiming to be conducting a background check for a potential employer. He asked detailed questions about my financial history, my relationships, my family situation, and my past addresses. When I contacted the companies I'd applied to work with, none of them had hired an investigator. Dorothy had taken the extraordinary step of paying someone to dig for dirt she could use against me. Within weeks, the fruits of her investigation became apparent. Jennifer had gotten married to Bradley Morrison, heir to a successful construction company, and Dorothy now had access to serious financial resources. They used Bradley's money and connections to launch a multi-pronged assault on my reputation and prospects that was far more sophisticated than anything they'd attempted before. The legal attack came first. Jennifer filed a harassment suit against me, claiming I'd been stalking her and making threatening phone calls for years. She produced fabricated evidence including fake call logs, doctored text messages, and testimony from friends who swore they'd witnessed my supposed obsession with my sister. The lawsuit was clearly frivolous, but it served its purpose of creating a public record that painted me as unstable and dangerous. "We just want to live in peace," Jennifer told the local newspaper, playing the role of the terrified victim perfectly. "But Natalie can't accept that she's no longer part of our family. She's been escalating her behavior for years, and we finally had to take legal action to protect ourselves." The lawsuit forced me to hire an attorney I couldn't afford and spend months defending myself against accusations that anyone who knew me would recognize as absurd. But the real damage wasn't in the courtroom, it was in the court of public opinion, where Jennifer's narrative of the psychotic ex-sister stalking her happy family became widely accepted truth. Dorothy simultaneously launched a campaign to destroy my business prospects by spreading rumors about financial irregularities and ethical violations in our startup. She contacted potential investors with stories about my character, suggesting they should be wary of doing business with someone who'd betrayed her own family. She even went so far as to create fake online reviews and complaints, building a digital paper trail that made me appear untrustworthy and incompetent. The most devastating attack came when Dorothy targeted Jake directly, using her new financial resources to pressure his family's business. The Matthews family owned a small but successful accounting firm, and Dorothy arranged for several major clients to threaten to take their business elsewhere unless Jake's family cut ties with me. "We can't have our financial advisors associating with someone of questionable character," one client explained to Jake's father. "It reflects poorly on your firm's judgment and attention to risk factors." Jake's father found himself in an impossible position. Supporting me was potentially ruining his family's livelihood and jeopardizing his other son's inheritance. The pressure on Jake to abandon our partnership became enormous, with family dinners turning into interventions and ultimatums. "I believe you're innocent," Jake's mother told him during one particularly emotional confrontation, "but believing in someone and risking your entire family's future for them are two different things. How can you ask us to sacrifice everything we've built for a girl you've known for 2 years?" The strain nearly broke us both. Jake was watching his family's business suffer because of his association with me, while I was watching the one person who'd stood by me face impossible choices because of Dorothy's relentless campaign. The guilt was overwhelming, and I seriously considered ending our partnership to protect him from further damage. But Jake surprised me by refusing to give in to the pressure. Instead of abandoning me, he proposed that we accelerate our timeline and take our company public as quickly as possible. "If we can prove our success definitively," he argued, "it becomes much harder for anyone to paint us as failures or frauds." We worked 18-hour days for months, pouring everything we had into developing our product and securing major contracts. Our software platform was genuinely innovative, and we managed to sign deals with 3 major nonprofit networks that validated our concept and provided substantial revenue. We were building something real and valuable, creating success that even Dorothy couldn't diminish through lies and manipulation. The breakthrough came when we landed a contract with a national foundation that worked with homeless youth. The irony wasn't lost on me that my own experience with homelessness had given me insights that made our product uniquely effective for this population. We were featured in several business magazines as an example of young entrepreneurs using technology for social good, and the positive publicity began to counteract years of negative rumors. But Dorothy wasn't finished. As our success became more visible and harder to dismiss, she decided to play her most dangerous card yet. She contacted the district attorney's office with allegations of financial fraud, claiming that I'd been embezzling money from investors and using our nonprofit clients as a front for money laundering operations. "I hate to report my own daughter," she told the investigating officer, her voice heavy with fake regret, "but I can't stand by while innocent organizations are being victimized. Natalie has been troubled since childhood, and I'm afraid her problems have escalated to criminal behavior." The investigation that followed was thorough and terrifying. Federal agents seized our computers and financial records, interviewed our clients and investors, and scrutinized every transaction we'd ever made. For 6 months, our company was essentially frozen while investigators tried to find evidence of the crimes Dorothy had alleged. The stress nearly destroyed both Jake and me. We watched years of work hang in the balance while prosecutors tried to build a case based on Dorothy's fabricated accusations. Our clients began to distance themselves, afraid of being associated with a company under federal investigation. Investors pulled their funding, and potential partners canceled meetings. Jake's family business suffered even more severe consequences as clients fled anything connected to the investigation. His father's health declined under the stress, and his mother stopped speaking to him entirely. The price of loyalty to me was destroying everything Jake had ever cared about, and I could see him questioning whether I was worth the sacrifice. The vindication, when it finally came, was complete but costly. The federal investigation concluded that Dorothy's allegations were entirely baseless, finding no evidence of financial impropriety or fraud. More importantly for my future, they discovered evidence of Dorothy's campaign of harassment, including records of the payments she'd made to the private investigator and documentation of her attempts to interfere with our business relationships. In 30 years of law enforcement, the lead investigator told me, I've rarely seen such a systematic campaign of harassment by a family member. What's been done to you borders on stalking and definitely constitutes intentional interference with business relationships. We were cleared of all allegations, and our reputation in the business community was largely restored. But the damage to our personal lives was severe. Jake's relationship with his family was permanently altered, and my own emotional reserves were nearly exhausted from years of constant attacks. As I sat in our office the night after the investigation concluded, surrounded by the remnants of the company we'd almost lost, I realized that surviving Dorothy's attacks wasn't enough anymore. She'd proven that she would never stop trying to destroy me, no matter how successful I became or how much collateral damage she caused to innocent people. It was time to stop playing defense and start playing offense. Dorothy wanted a war, and I was finally ready to give her one. The decision to investigate Dorothy came after another sleepless night spent wondering when the next attack would come and who else might get hurt in the crossfire. Jake's family was still rebuilding their business, and I could see the toll that years of stress had taken on everyone around me. I was tired of being reactive, tired of waiting for Dorothy to strike, tired of watching good people suffer because of her obsession with destroying me. I hired Marcus Webb, a former FBI agent turned private investigator who specialized in cases involving family harassment and financial fraud. Marcus was expensive, but he was thorough, and he had the resources to conduct the kind of comprehensive investigation that could finally give me the ammunition I needed to fight back effectively. What you've described isn't just family dysfunction, Marcus explained during our first meeting. This is a pattern of criminal behavior that's likely been going on for years. People who conduct this level of systematic harassment usually have other victims and other secrets. Marcus's investigation began with Dorothy's financial records, and the discoveries were stunning. Through a complex network of shell companies and fake identities, Dorothy had been embezzling money from the local charity where she served as treasurer. Over the course of 8 years, she'd stolen nearly $200,000 meant for underprivileged children, using sophisticated accounting tricks to hide the missing funds. But the financial crimes were just the beginning. Marcus discovered that Dorothy had been collecting Social Security benefits for a child who didn't exist, claiming that she had a disabled son who required full-time care. She'd been receiving monthly payments for David Harrison for 12 years, complete with fake medical records and forged doctor signatures. The most shocking revelation came when Marcus traced Dorothy's history back to before Jennifer was born. Dorothy had given birth to another child, Michael, when she was 19 years old. Instead of raising him, she'd given him up for adoption and then systematically erased all evidence of his existence from her life. Michael had spent his childhood in foster care, never knowing that his mother was living comfortably just 2 states away. Your mother has a pattern of abandoning children when they become inconvenient, Marcus explained, showing me the adoption records. Michael was given up because he was born with a minor learning disability that required extra attention. She wanted a perfect family, not a child who would need special care. The documentation was overwhelming. Dorothy had been living a lie for decades, presenting herself as a pillar of the community while systematically defrauding charities, government programs, and even her own family. Richard, it turned out, was largely ignorant of her criminal activities, but he'd been enabling her psychological abuse for years out of weakness and fear. Armed with this evidence, I made the decision to confront Dorothy directly before taking legal action. I wanted to give her one chance to end her campaign against me voluntarily, and I wanted to see her face when she realized that her carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. The confrontation took place at a coffee shop near their house, neutral territory where Dorothy would feel safe enough to speak freely. I arrived early and chose a table in the back corner, away from other customers but still public enough to prevent any dramatic outbursts. Dorothy arrived exactly on time, looking confident and composed. She'd probably expected this meeting to be another opportunity to manipulate me, to convince me to abandon my education and business ventures and disappear quietly from her life. Instead, she found herself facing someone who knew all her secrets. "Hello, Mother," I said quietly, gesturing to the chair across from me. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Dorothy sat down carefully, her eyes already calculating. "I hope this means you're ready to discuss ending this foolishness and making peace with your family," she began, but I cut her off with a raised hand. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about Michael," I said, watching her face carefully. "Your first child. The one you gave up for adoption because he wasn't perfect enough for your standards." The change in Dorothy's expression was immediate and dramatic. All the color drained from her face, and her carefully maintained composure cracked like thin ice. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, but her eyes betrayed her panic. I pulled out a copy of Michael's birth certificate and placed it on the table between us. "I also wanted to discuss the $200,000 you've stolen from the children's charity over the past 8 years. And the fake disability benefits you've been collecting for your non-existent son David." Dorothy stared at the documents in horror, realizing that her entire criminal enterprise had been exposed. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. She looked old and fragile, nothing like the powerful figure who'd terrorized my childhood. But then her expression hardened, and the Dorothy I knew returned in full force. "You think you're so clever," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You think you can threaten me with some fabricated evidence?" "It's not fabricated, and we both know it," I replied calmly. "The question is what happens next. You can agree to leave me and my business alone permanently, or I can turn all of this over to the authorities and let them sort it out." Dorothy's laugh was bitter and desperate. "You think anyone will believe you? I'm a respected member of this community. I've been volunteering and contributing for 20 years. Who do you think they'll believe when I tell them you're trying to frame me?" It was exactly the response I'd expected, and I was prepared for it. "Actually, I think they'll believe the FBI agents who've been investigating your charity fraud for the past 6 months, I said, pulling out my phone. "I called them before our meeting. They should be arriving at your house right about now." Dorothy's face went white as she realized I wasn't bluffing. Through the coffee shop window, she could see police cars with flashing lights turning onto her street. The investigation was real, the evidence was solid, and her carefully maintained reputation was about to be destroyed permanently. "You vindictive little bitch," she snarled, dropping all pretense of maternal authority. "You've destroyed this family out of spite and jealousy." "No," I said quietly, standing up to leave. "You destroyed this family the day you decided to throw away a child because she wasn't convenient. Everything that's happened since then has been your choice." As I walked away from that coffee shop, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine peace. Not satisfaction or revenge, but the quiet relief of someone who'd finally stopped running from a bully and discovered that the bully wasn't nearly as powerful as she'd pretended to be. Dorothy's empire of lies was crumbling, and for the first time since my 18th birthday, I was truly free from her reach. But I wasn't finished yet. There were still wrongs to be righted and people to help, starting with Michael, the brother I'd never known I had. The federal investigation moved swiftly once I provided Marcus's evidence to the authorities. Within 2 weeks, Dorothy was arrested at her home on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and theft of government benefits. The local news covered the story extensively, and the community that had revered Dorothy Harrison as a charitable pillar was shocked to learn about her decades of criminal behavior. Jennifer's reaction to her mother's arrest was predictably self-serving. She immediately distanced herself from Dorothy, claiming she'd been as much a victim of manipulation as anyone else. She sold the story to a local television station, painting herself as the innocent daughter who'd been used as a weapon against me without understanding the true scope of her mother's psychological problems. "I see now that my mother was seriously ill," Jennifer told the sympathetic interviewer, dabbing her eyes with tissues. "She convinced me that Natalie was dangerous, that we needed to protect ourselves. I realize now that I was being manipulated into participating in something terrible. But Dorothy wasn't finished fighting, even from jail. She used her one phone call to contact Bradley Morrison's family, spinning a desperate story about how I'd framed her using fabricated evidence and corrupt investigators. She claimed the entire investigation was revenge for her trying to protect the community from a dangerous sociopath. Bradley's family had significant political connections and enough money to cause real problems for the prosecution. They hired expensive lawyers and began applying pressure to have the charges dropped or reduced, arguing that Dorothy was being persecuted by a vindictive daughter with mental health issues. The campaign to discredit me reached its peak when Dorothy's legal team hired a public relations firm to manage her image during the trial. They portrayed her as a loving mother who'd been driven to desperate measures by a daughter's increasingly erratic and threatening behavior. They claimed I'd been manipulating evidence for years, building toward this moment when I could destroy my family completely. The PR campaign was sophisticated and effective. They produced character witnesses who testified to Dorothy's charitable work and community involvement. They brought in psychological experts who analyzed my behavior and suggested that I showed signs of antisocial personality disorder. They even convinced some of my former teachers to question whether my academic success had been achieved through dishonest means. For several terrifying weeks, it seemed like Dorothy might succeed in turning the tables one final time. The media narrative began to shift in her favor, with some commentators suggesting that the real story was about a troubled young woman's elaborate revenge plot against the family that had tried to help her. The breaking point came when Dorothy's lawyers arranged for her to give a jailhouse interview with a sympathetic journalist. She used the opportunity to deliver a performance that was both heartbreaking and completely fabricated, portraying herself as a grieving mother whose love had been twisted into something ugly by a daughter's mental illness. "I see now that I enabled Natalie's problems by trying to protect her," Dorothy said, her voice breaking with manufactured emotion. "I should have gotten her professional help years ago, but I kept hoping that love and patience would be enough. Now innocent people are suffering because I wasn't strong enough to do what was necessary." The interview was devastating to watch. Dorothy was convincing and sympathetic, playing the role of the heartbroken mother with the skill of a professional actress. She admitted to some mistakes in judgment while portraying herself as fundamentally a victim of circumstances beyond her control. But Dorothy had made one crucial error in her desperation to escape justice. During the interview, she mentioned details about my childhood that directly contradicted the official story she'd told authorities for years. She described punishments and restrictions that she'd previously denied, inadvertently corroborating my accounts of abuse that her lawyers had been calling fabricated memories. Marcus caught the inconsistencies immediately and brought them to the prosecutor's attention. When confronted with the contradictions, Dorothy's legal team couldn't explain why their client's story kept changing. The carefully constructed defense began to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The final blow to Dorothy's credibility came from an unexpected source. Michael Harrison, my half-brother, had been following the case through news reports and decided to come forward with his own story. Now 32 years old and a successful teacher in Colorado, Michael provided crucial testimony about Dorothy's pattern of abandoning children when they became inconvenient. She told the adoption agency that she couldn't handle a child with special needs, Michael testified via video conference. "But I was eventually diagnosed with mild dyslexia, nothing that required extraordinary care. She gave me up because I wasn't the perfect child she'd imagined." Michael's testimony destroyed Dorothy's image as a loving mother who'd been victimized by an ungrateful daughter. Here was clear evidence that she'd abandoned children before, that her pattern of abuse and rejection went back decades. The jury could see that I wasn't an isolated case of family dysfunction, but part of a long history of Dorothy's inability to love unconditionally. Richard's testimony was the final nail in Dorothy's coffin. Under oath, he admitted that he'd witnessed years of emotional abuse and done nothing to stop it. He described Dorothy's systematic campaigns against me, her deliberate attempts to sabotage my education and career, her obsession with punishing me for existing. "I was afraid of her," Richard said quietly, looking older than his 55 years. "I knew what she was doing was wrong, but I was too weak to stand up to her. I convinced myself that maybe she knew something I didn't, that maybe Natalie really was as troubled as Dorothy claimed. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Dorothy was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to her victims. Her reputation in the community was permanently destroyed, and the charitable organizations she'd defrauded implemented new oversight procedures to prevent similar crimes. Jennifer's marriage to Bradley Morrison didn't survive the scandal. His family forced him to choose between his wife and his inheritance, and Bradley chose the money. Jennifer found herself divorced, unemployed, and facing civil lawsuits from several of Dorothy's victims who held her responsible for participating in the harassment campaign against me. As I watched Dorothy being led away in handcuffs after her sentencing, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph or satisfaction, but a deep sadness for all the years that had been wasted, all the relationships that had been poisoned by her inability to love without conditions. The frightened little girl who'd been thrown out of her house 11 years earlier had finally defeated the monster who'd created her. But the victory felt hollow because it had come at such an enormous cost to everyone involved. Dorothy would spend her remaining healthy years in prison, Jennifer had lost everything she'd valued, and Richard was left alone to face the consequences of his decades of enabling. I'd won the war, but I wasn't sure anyone had really been saved by the victory. The only consolation was that Dorothy would never again be in a position to destroy another child's life the way she'd tried to destroy mine. 11 years after being thrown out of my childhood home, I stood in front of that same house holding a check for $1 million. But it wasn't meant as a gesture of triumph or revenge. It was meant as a donation to the children's charity that Dorothy had defrauded, money to replace what she'd stolen and help repair some of the damage she'd caused. Our company had been acquired by a major tech corporation for $47 million, making Jake and me wealthy beyond anything I'd imagined when I was sleeping in parks and searching through dumpsters for food. But success had taught me that money alone couldn't heal the wounds that years of abuse had created. Real healing required something much more difficult, the choice to forgive. Dorothy was serving her sentence in a minimum security federal prison about an hour outside Austin. I'd been visiting her monthly for 6 months, trying to understand how a mother could wage such a systematic campaign against her own child. The conversations were difficult and often painful, but they were necessary for both of us to move forward. The woman I found in prison was very different from the powerful figure who'd terrorized my childhood. Dorothy was 63 now, and 8 years of living with the consequences of her choices had aged her beyond her years. She'd been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, which explained some of her increasingly irrational behavior during the final years of her campaign against me. "I don't remember being that angry," she said during one of our conversations, her voice small and confused. "I remember being afraid that you were going to leave me, that I was going to lose another child. But I don't remember deciding to hurt you." It was heartbreaking to realize that Dorothy's cruelty might have been driven by the same fear of abandonment that had motivated my own desperate need to succeed. She'd given up Michael and then spent decades terrified that I would leave her too. Her attempts to control and punish me had been twisted expressions of love, filtered through mental illness and unresolved trauma from her own childhood. Jennifer had reached out to me several months after Dorothy's conviction, asking if we could meet for coffee. I'd agreed, curious to see if my sister had gained any insight from watching our family's spectacular collapse. The woman I met was humbled and broken, nothing like the confident manipulator who'd participated in Dorothy's campaigns against me. "I know you have no reason to forgive me," Jennifer said, her hands shaking as she spoke. "I know I was horrible to you, and I can't take any of that back. But I want you to know that I understand now what I did wrong, and I'm sorry." Jennifer had been in therapy since her divorce, working to understand how she'd become complicit in Dorothy's abuse. She'd discovered that she'd been as much a victim of manipulation as I had been, trained from early childhood to compete for Dorothy's approval by diminishing my worth. It didn't excuse her actions, but it helped explain them. "Mom convinced me that love was scarce," Jennifer explained through tears. "She made me believe that if she loved you, there wouldn't be enough left for me. I was so afraid of losing her approval that I became willing to do anything to maintain it, even if it meant destroying my own sister. The conversation was painful for both of us, but it was also healing. Jennifer couldn't undo the years of cruelty, but she could acknowledge the truth about what had happened and take responsibility for her part in it. That acknowledgement was the first step toward rebuilding some kind of relationship between us. Richard had moved into a small apartment after losing the family house to pay Dorothy's legal fees and restitution. He was working as a bookkeeper for a local business, trying to rebuild his life at an age when most people were thinking about retirement. When I visited him, I found a man who'd been hollowed out by guilt and regret. "I failed you," he said simply when I asked why he'd never protected me from Dorothy's abuse. "I was weak and scared, and I let terrible things happen because it was easier than standing up to your mother. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I see clearly now what I should have done." Richard's recognition of his failures was genuine, but it couldn't repair the damage that years of neglect had caused. I could forgive him for being weak, but I couldn't forget that his weakness had enabled Dorothy's cruelty to flourish unchecked. Forgiveness didn't require forgetting or pretending that serious harm hadn't been done. The decision to establish the Harrison Family Foundation for Homeless Youth was my way of transforming all the pain and trauma into something constructive. Using the money from our company sale, Jake and I created a comprehensive program that provided education, job training, and emotional support for teenagers aging out of foster care or escaping abusive family situations. "You could have used this money for anything," Jake pointed out when I explained my plans for the foundation. "You could have bought houses and cars and traveled the world. Why choose to help other people instead?" The answer was simple but hard to articulate. Having survived Dorothy's attempts to destroy me, I understood that real strength came not from accumulating wealth or power, but from using whatever advantages you'd gained to help others who were facing similar struggles. The foundation was my way of ensuring that other young people wouldn't have to face homelessness and rejection alone the way I had. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez became the foundation's first program director, bringing her decades of education experience and genuine care for struggling students. She'd apologized repeatedly for doubting me years earlier, but I understood that she'd been manipulated by people who were skilled at presenting convincing lies. Her willingness to admit her mistake and help repair the damage was all the redemption either of us needed. Michael flew in from Colorado for the foundation's launch event, and meeting my half-brother was one of the most healing experiences of the entire journey. He was kind and thoughtful, nothing like the troubled child Dorothy had described to justify giving him up for adoption. His success as a teacher and his stable marriage proved that Dorothy's assessment of his potential had been completely wrong. "She told me I was defective," Michael said as we talked about our shared experience of Dorothy's rejection. "But I think maybe she was the one who was broken, and she couldn't handle children who reminded her of her own limitations." As I stood before the crowd at our foundation's opening ceremony, looking out at an audience that included former teachers, business partners, social workers, and several teenagers who would be our first scholarship recipients, I realized that the little girl who'd been thrown away for being a worthless mistake had finally found her true family. It wasn't the people who'd shared her DNA, but the community of individuals who'd chosen to support and believe in each other. "Sometimes our greatest wounds become our greatest strengths," I said in my speech that day. "Not because suffering makes us better people, but because surviving suffering teaches us how to help others survive theirs. The most important lesson I've learned is that love isn't about perfection or convenience. Real love means showing up for people when they need you, especially when it's difficult or costly to do so." Dorothy would be eligible for parole in 4 years, and I planned to be there to support her transition back into society. Not because I owed her anything, but because choosing forgiveness over revenge was the only way to ensure that the cycle of hurt ended with me. Jennifer was rebuilding her life slowly, attending college for the first time and working toward a degree in social work. Richard had become a volunteer for our foundation, using his accounting skills to help young people learn financial literacy. The broken family that had once seemed beyond repair was finding new ways to connect and support each other. It looked nothing like the traditional happy ending I'd dreamed of as a child, but it was real and honest and built on truth rather than fantasy. As I drove away from the foundation's launch event that evening, I passed by my old house one more time. New owners had painted it blue and planted different flowers in the front yard, erasing the last physical reminders of the Harrison family's toxic legacy. The little girl who'd once lived behind those walls was finally free to become whoever she chose to be. I thought about all the young people who would benefit from our foundation's programs, all the teenagers who would get second chances and support systems, and the message that their worth wasn't determined by the families who'd failed them. Breaking the cycle of abandonment and abuse was the most meaningful success I could imagine, more valuable than any business achievement or personal wealth. The journey from homeless teenager to successful entrepreneur to foundation founder had taught me that our greatest power lies not in accumulating advantages for ourselves, but in using whatever we've gained to lift others up. Sometimes the children who are thrown away become the adults who build bridges back to hope for the next generation. And that legacy, built from love rather than fear, was something that no one could ever take away. I want to leave you with a question that's been on my heart throughout this entire journey. Have you ever had to rebuild your life after someone you trusted tried to destroy it? Drop a comment below and share your story, because I've learned that our struggles become our strength when we share them with others who understand. If this story touched your heart or reminded you that you're stronger than whatever tried to break you, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe, because I'll be sharing more stories about overcoming family trauma and building the life you deserve, not the one others think you should have. Remember, you are not defined by the people who couldn't see your worth. You are defined by how you choose to use your strength to help others find theirs. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and I hope my story reminds you that sometimes our greatest victories come not from proving others wrong, but from choosing to love anyway. Until next time, keep fighting for the life that sets your soul free.